The phrase I get all the time is I'm always trying to shove my agenda down their throat, which seems sexually charged to me. I don't know.
It's that butter shit niggas know I always never stutter with. Styles. Check it. Deep it.
Representation is one of the most important things in media. The ability to see yourself in stuff can do wonders for people. Seeing someone that looks and feels like you have a whole story told about them makes it feel like no matter your circumstances or where you come from or who you love, you still matter. But for me, it never really mattered that much. Not that I ever thought representation wasn't vital, far from it. It's just that I never really needed to see someone that looked like me to deeply relate to a character. For me, it was always about the personality. Didn't matter their race, gender, or sexuality. For me, the big thing was, does this character feel like me? Divorced from all that stuff. And I think the reason I felt that way was because as a nerdy black kid growing up, it felt like my blackness was always in question. Until I hit high school, I went to exclusively black schools. And even though I had friends, for the most part, it felt like I never really fit in. Kids at school would call me white because I didn't watch sports or keep up with every rap beef, because of how I spoke, the media I consumed, or that my nose was always buried in a book. And a lot of the characters that I saw on TV that were black were either super athletic, extremely geeky, or real hood. All things I wasn't. Not that I didn't enjoy those characters, I did, but it felt like the black experience was a monolith. Like there was only one way to be black, and if you didn't fit it, you were out. So I kinda drifted away from my culture because it felt like it didn't want me. But when I was a kid, there was always one character. One that talked like me, acted like me, and most of all, felt like me. The one character where him being black actually meant the world to me. And that character was Static.
The name's Static. I put a shock to your system.
Static felt like the first character that was written specifically for me, and I'm sure a lot of you can relate. My favorite superhero is and always will be Spider-Man, but Static felt like a Spider-Man made for people like me. You know, before there was a Spider-Man for people like me. But Miles never would have been able to take that leap of faith if Static didn't lay the groundwork. And over the years, he's become incredibly important to me. Like Velma in that one scene in Zombie Island important.
This just gets better and better. Maybe from where you're standing.
Sorry, I felt like I was getting too serious. Had to drop in some classic D'Angelo. But back to Static. The show was one of my favorite things growing up. And as I got older, I learned that a big part of what made it so good was the man behind the curtain, Dwayne McDuffie. And the more shows I watched, especially the ones that resonated with me the hardest, that name kept popping up. Teen Titans, Ben 10, Justice League. Every single one had McDuffie writing on it, and I realized that there was something special about his stories. It was the exact kind of stuff I wanted to make, and the real kicker was, he was black too. He lived in the world that meant so much to me, but he never lost sight of his identity. He used it, and that meant so much to me. Just like how Stag became an important character to me, Dwayne McDuffie became an important person to me. So today, to honor his legacy, and to work through a few of my own issues, I want to celebrate him in the work he helped create, especially Static. So, enough preamble, let's get to the main event. I'm your host, and I think just that for this one, D'Angelo Edwards. And today, I'm taking my hat off to Static Shock.
Now will ya? I got the looks that thrill ya. If you're down, I'll feel ya. Yeah, coming up like weeds.
Hey, Puff Daddy, you're taking a long time for a guy with only 5 whiskers.
Don't call him that. Don't you ever call him that.
Okay, before we get into the show itself, we have a ton of history to get into.
What, so there's homework now?
And as much as I love McDuffie, the story of Static doesn't really start with him. It actually starts in the neighborhood of Springfield Gardens, Queens, with a little kid named Dennis Cohen.
Everything to the maximum, from rapping to stacking
writing ones, not funds, albums with puns full of light. Yo, it can overlap the sun. They run it back before the track is done.
Now at this point, Dennis had never even seen a comic book, which meant he still had a shot at being a normal person. But those chances were quickly dashed when his best friend, Derek Dingle, came over to his house holding a huge stack of comics. Up until now, most of Dennis's experiences with superheroes had been watching the old Adventures of Superman show on TV. And even just with that, he was already hooked. His mother always used to paint for fun, so he grew up surrounded by her art, which naturally led him to draw. And after seeing Superman, he began to draw his own adventures featuring the Man of Steel. In a funny way, he kinda stumbled into doing comics by accident. In an interview with Comic Book Resources, Dennis said,
"Somehow, I put it together that I wanted to see Superman adventures of my own. So I would draw these boxes and put stick figure Superman in his little adventures. But the box represented a television screen, not a comic book panel, because I had never seen a comic book. So I would draw these sequential television scenes as a Superman story, and it wasn't until I got literally into 3rd grade that I saw my first comic book, because I just wasn't around them."
Dude had never even picked up an issue and he just kind of figured out the basics. So when he finally got his hands on his first comic book, an issue of Jack Kirby's New Gods, hard recommend, it was like a whole new world opened up for him.
From that moment, I just looked at them and I was just gone. After that, I probably went to school to look at comic books. More than anything, like to get the new comic books from Derek.
From that point on, he lived and breathed comics. He became completely obsessed. Things really shook up for him when he saw his first comic starring Luke Cage, which at that point was the coolest thing he'd ever seen. You have to remember, during this time, there were not many black characters in comics, and the ones that were there were
Mama little baby love shortening.
questionable to say the least. I mean, who wouldn't want to hear the stories of Whitewashed Jones, who can make a harmonica talk and watermelons disappear?
That's good old-fashioned family racism.
So when stuff like Luke Cage and Black Panther started rolling in, Dennis and Derek learned that characters that look like them could exist, and they could be awesome. They started drawing tons of comics featuring their own black superheroes, with some of their faves being Black Vig and Jive. Hey, don't laugh, we all gotta start somewhere. I thought I peaked when I made Cowboy Man, a man with all the powers of a cowboy. Wait, that's still genius. No one steal that, I have a patent. And as they sat and drew the days away, they dreamed of their characters being famous. Sadly, these times were never meant to last, and the day after they graduated from grade school, Derek moved away, leaving Dennis all alone. But just because he lost his friend, it didn't mean he had lost his passion for comics. He ended up going to the High School of Art and Design, which led to him rubbing elbows with a couple of guys in the comic industry, eventually landing a job as an assistant to Rich Buckler, who's worked on everything from Adam to Zatanna, though he's probably best known for creating the character Deathlock, a sick-as-hell undead cyborg dude. He also helped out Arvell Jones, who at the time was one of the few black people working professionally in comics. He was the whole reason Dennis even showed up, and I do mean showed up. Bro was not invited.
One day, this 14-year-old kid came over to our apartment, knocked on the door, and I opened it and was, "Hey, you're Arvell Jones. Hey, it's really great to meet you." And he just kind of barged his way in, threw down some of his artwork and told me, "Hey man, I'll do whatever I can do."
All the artists living there admired his guts, so they gave him a bunch of odd jobs to do. Getting coffee, sweeping floors, getting told not to draw, that was a big one. In fact, I'm pretty sure his main job was not to draw, but his foot was in the door, and that was all that mattered. Let that be a lesson to all you aspiring artists out there. If things are moving too slow, just pick an artist and show up at their house. I'd rather live with consequences than regrets. But Dennis had made it in, and this led to some small but meaningful opportunities. There were still a couple of hurdles to get over. Dude was still a black man trying to enter a predominantly white business.
3 years later, I was like 17. I had a chance to bring my portfolio into the art director at DC at the time. He looks at my portfolio, my heart's beating. I remember that now. This is good. Handed it back, looked at me, said, "These are good, but we already have a colored artist working for us."
Hey, I got niggas. Where? In the street. What streets?
His first ever real job was doing a pinup for the Incredible Hulk, which by his own admission was probably pretty bad, and he doesn't even know if it ever got printed. After that, he did a couple of short stories here and there for DC, with the first one being a story for Weird War Tales. But forget about that, check out this Twinkies ad from the same issue.
Who's this Twinkie Cakes? Let me get my hands on them. Give me that golden sponge cake.
I long for the simpler times when superheroes would just try and sell me snack cakes. We are a fallen civilization. As Dennis got some experience under his belt, he started working on bigger and better projects. He finally got the chance to work on Luke Cage and Black Panther, adding a lot more nuance to the stories by bringing in real issues that black people were dealing with, like gang violence and apartheid. And he met artists like Christopher Priest and Michael Davis, and yes, Dwayne McDuffie, who at the time was one of the very few black comic book writers. They even worked together on Deathlock and the official Prince comic book. Did not know this existed, needed more than air. Dennis was at the top of his game. Dude was even posing in magazines like he was a GQ model. But still, something was missing.
And I'm thinking about this music I'm listening to. And I'm thinking about the comics I've drawn. And I'm thinking about where are the black superheroes.
Even though they had all made it into the business, they still weren't working with the kind of characters that they wanted to work with. Luke Cage and Black Panther were great and super important to them, but at the end of the day, they were still characters created by white men. And it made Dennis think back to those days of drawing his own characters and dreaming of the day that he would bring his own black characters to life. And it was still all he wanted. So the gears started turning, and what happened next would be a major milestone in comic book history. In 1991, Dennis was in California attending Comic-Con, and his head was buzzing with plans. Times were changing, and now more than ever, he felt like the world needed more black people telling their stories, and telling them the way they wanted to. And with racial relations getting worse following the Rodney King riots, he wanted black kids to have someone to look up to. They needed heroes, and he wanted to be the one to create them. Going back to that same interview from the comic book resource, Dennis said while lying down with his partner,
I remember just shooting up straight in bed going, oh my god, I think I know what we have to do. And she was like, what do you have to do? And I was like, we have to start a black comic book company. And she's looking at me like I'm nuts. And I'm like, well, I think that's the only way we can do these characters that we want to do.
From that moment on, it was about to get real black in the comic industry. You could practically hear it from the streets. Dennis got together with Davis, Priest, and McDuffie to whip up a pitch bible full of characters that would all inhabit the same universe and represent a bunch of different walks of life that had yet to have their time in the sun. Not only black characters, but Latino, Native American, gay, trans, everyone was going to get their story told. Dennis even got a chance to reunite with Derek Dingle, who had reconnected with him after seeing his name on a comic book. And not only did he bring in his comic knowledge, but his business knowledge, as he went on to become the editor-in-chief at Black Enterprise magazine. Like, this is the coolest thing ever to me. This should be taught at every school. Hearing stories like this could change kids' lives. I know it would have affected mine. All of them contributed to the pitch bible, adding in heroes, how the world worked, and backstories. But it was Dwayne McDuffie that took everything and really distilled it into its finished form. He kind of became the heart of the group. Something about his writing that really brought characters to life. He could take these larger-than-life heroes and make them feel like real people. It's something I've always admired about his work. And when it was all said and done, they cooked the Bible and presented it to Paul Levitz, an executive and writer for DC at the time. And at that moment, history changed forever.
He couldn't put it down. Every time he put it down, he'd pick it back up.
So Monday morning, he calls me on my phone and says, Dennis, this is great. We want to do it. Come down and meet with us.
This was the birth of Milestone Media.
want to give people that shock of recognition I got the first time I saw a black superhero, and I went, wow, you know, I could do this. I could be Superman.
While Milestone Comics will be published by DC, they were their own separate entity in business. That meant they had a lot more freedom and control over their characters. It wasn't complete freedom, mind you. They were still using DC's money, but it was head and shoulders above anything else that had been done to that point, and they were a hit.
These Milestone comic books are really dope, man. I got this Blood Syndicate, man. They got all kind of people in here. What you got? Icon, man. Oh, hey, what you got, Dre? Look at hardware, man. All 3 issues, man.
You know all those posts you see on social media calling for Superman or Batman to be made black? I always think that's stupid because it's not really gonna do anything, you know, except make racist people louder. It would be a lot more meaningful to create original black superheroes that carried on the spirit of those characters that came before them, and that was Milestone's mission statement. They created some really cool characters that could stand toe-to-toe with the best of DC and Marvel. They made characters like Icon, an alien raised by a slave who's pushed to use his powers for good by his young sidekick, Rocket. There was the Blood Syndicate, a group of gang members that came together after gaining superpowers, and Hardware, who created a powerful suit of armor to fight against corrupt businesses. You look at these characters and you can see where the inspiration comes from, but rather than feeling like cheap copies, they're interesting in their own right, and they were dealing with real and pressing issues. Rocket goes through a teen pregnancy. Blood Syndicate had gay and trans characters in a time where you hardly ever saw positive representations of that group. You can read a lot of these stories today and they still feel relevant. And they didn't just write these characters, they actually got writers and artists that lived these lifestyles to work for them.
There was like this invisible bubble, shield around us, because as soon as they picked up the book and thought it was a gay one, they would drop it like it was on fire or something like that. And Dwayne was one of these guys who picked up the book, and then he started talking to me about Blood Syndicate, and I think I got a job for you.
They didn't just talk about it, they were about it. And I think the popularity of their comics reflected that. Milestone Comics were the talk of the town for a while. They had people like John Singleton and Quincy Jones coming to visit them at their office. Imagine just going to work and seeing Quincy Jones standing there. I would have been a mess. But by far, the most popular character they made was Static. Yeah, remember when this video was about him? Static was one of Dwayne's favorite characters in Milestone. He was a character who was basically meant to represent the people they had created Milestone for. Nerdy black kids that loved comics. Static was that. Or maybe I should say Virgil Hawkins was that. Static tells the story of Virgil, in how after getting caught up in the middle of a gang war, he was dosed with tear gas laced with mutagenic chemicals in an event called the Big Bang. While a lot of people died, some of them gained new powers, including Virgil, who got electricity powers. Now he protects the streets of Dakota as the high-voltage hero, Static. And while I know Dwayne gets a lot of the credit for creating Static, it wasn't just him. All of the founders at Milestone had input on him. But most importantly, a lot of Static was informed by Robert L. Washington III and John Paul Leon. Washington's writing perfectly complemented Dwayne's, making Virgil feel like a real kid. A kid like I was. He loved sci-fi, he was smart, he was a nerd, but he wasn't just urkeling all over the place. He talked like a real person, like he's making these these corny jokes and goofing around, and the slang actually feels real. We've come a long way from Luke Cage shouting "Sweet Christmas."
I mean, who talks like that? Really?
And Leon's art really fleshed out Static's world. The characters are stylized just enough, and the action scenes with Static are really kinetic and have great composition. The way he used his powers was really cool too. Not just lightning bolts and taser punches, he came up with some really cool ideas. McDuffie himself had a master's degree in physics, so he was able to show Static using his mind in addition to his powers. Dude just keeps getting cooler, man. I also love Static's outfit, especially once he starts wearing that jacket. The mix of traditional superhero spandex with streetwear is peak. Dude even rocked the Malcolm X hat in the beginning. Being subtle is for cowards. You just know they took some inspo for that look Miles had in Spider-Verse, at least in some way. Not to mention the inks by Steve Mitchell. It looks like he was doing it with a marker, so we got these really good bold outlines and harsh shadows. I love when stuff looks like this. They didn't draw on all the issues, but they carried the early run. I had only read a little bit of Static before this, so I decided to read at least the first few, and I was kind of hooked. They felt grounded, but not boring, if that makes sense. I'm not a huge fan of when superhero stories get so realistic and it gets to the point they forget their fiction, but Static keeps all the social and political aspects while remembering that we're still in a comic book. The dude shoots lightning out of his hand, you gotta remember to have some fun. But they still showed all the issues a kid like Virgil would be dealing with. He had to deal with gang violence and racism. Actually, scratch that. Now he had to deal with super-powered gang violence and racism. Kid can't catch a break. They even had a list of all the stuff they wanted to cover in their first issue. Static was the breakout hit at Milestone, and the rest of the series weren't slouches either, but behind the scenes, things were getting a little tougher. The market for comics was drying up, and even if Milestone comics were still selling, the money just wasn't the same.
Slowing down production for Milestone was death because it meant that people wouldn't get paid, books wouldn't get sold.
The way we had it set up was we would get an advance on every book, and that's how we were able to keep things rolling. The advances stopped, so we had to just fund it. Good luck with that.
Over time, they even lost their offices and had to start working out of the DC building. And not only was the business going through hardship, so was the relationship of the original Milestone group. It wasn't just one big thing, but a lot of little things over time that ended up putting a strain on the friendship. A big reason was Dwayne and Dennis were starting to clash more and more, especially over how strong they came on with all the social and political themes in the book. Dennis was more willing to go with the changes that DC wanted, but Dwayne fought them every step of the way. He didn't want his message to be filtered out, because what would even be the point of Milestone? And to be honest, I agree with him. Even though I can understand Dennis's point of not wanting to bite the hand that feeds you. Their biggest argument came over a cover that showed Static about to have sex with his girlfriend. They were just kissing, he didn't have his Static out or anything. But there were condoms shown on the ground. Dwayne just wanted to show a healthy portrayal of a black couple engaging in safe sex. A good message. But DC didn't want anything so blatantly provocative on their covers, despite the many contradictions to that. Ones that Dwayne was quick to address.
That was a huge fight, and I think a lot of it wasn't about sexuality, it was about black sexuality.
That was also another big problem the group was facing. Sure, there were a lot of people at DC that knew what Milestone was doing was important, but there were also a lot that didn't really care. They didn't think that books featuring black characters would appeal to a wide audience. Several retailers felt the same way, not wanting to order many books that were only for blacks. All of these factors and more led to Dwayne eventually stepping down from his position as editor-in-chief of Milestone, before eventually shutting down the comics division of Milestone Media in 1997. This really sucks because Milestone was a big deal. I didn't even get to enjoy it at its peak. My eyes were barely open before they stopped printing books. Everyone at Milestone took it really hard too, but no one took it harder than Dwayne. He essentially retired from the industry, washing his hands of the whole situation and moving to Florida. For a while, it looked like the comic world had lost one of its best and brightest. But life has a funny way of leading you back to your passions, and while most of Milestone was essentially dead, the only thing it really needed was a jump start. As early as 1993, Milestone was receiving pitches to make animated versions of their comics. The editor-in-chief of DC at the time, Jeanette Kahn, shopped around a ton of ideas, one of which being The New Guard, which would have been a team-up show featuring a bunch of different Milestone characters. I mean, Blood Syndicate was right there, though this was for Saturday morning cartoons, and I'm not sure people will be down to watch hardcore gang violence after Gummy Bears. That sounds like a good morning to me, but people are weak. When McDuffie saw the first script for it, he thought it was terrible and sent it back with tons of notes. But when he got the second draft, he adored it. In an interview with Captain Comics, he said that it included the single best introduction scene to Icon he had ever seen. The person that wrote that script was Alan Burnett, a man who has contributed to everything. It's everything. He did everything, guys. The Disney Afternoon, the entire DCAU, Freakazoid. If it ripped, he had a finger or two in it. Dude is a living legend. He was another person that was trying to get some of the Milestone characters into animation, and eventually, one of his pitches went through.
We got one!
And on September 23rd, 2000, the world will be introduced and reintroduced to Static Shock.
That Air Command, we are in pursuit of the bogey and closing in. Fortunately, I'm what you call one of your all-purpose superheroes. There was an explosion last night. There was this gas. It changed me, Richie. This is between you and me. Let's take this someplace so nobody can get hurt. You're not just Virgil anymore. You're Static. This is a city. There's metal everywhere, even if you can't always see it. I put a shock to your system. Good.
I was a big Kids WB fan as a kid. I never missed a Saturday if I could help it. And when this premiered, I was hooked. This was the character I had been looking for all along, and the show was awesome. While based on the comics, the show had made a few changes here and there to make it more child-friendly. Virgil was a little younger, fewer guns were shown, and the situations didn't feel as intense at first.
You couldn't do that in the video game. Or maybe I just never got to that level.
But the spirit was still there, and that was because not only did they get Dwayne back for the show, they also got Dennis. And while there was still a little beef left over between them from their days at Milestone, they put that aside to make a great TV show. We follow Virgil through his early days as Static, as he learns what it takes to be a hero. Virgil was instantly likable to me, quick to make a joke and a little cocky, but still kind-hearted enough to help anyone, even his enemies.
Ripping off sporting goods stores? What kind of athlete are you, Barnett? How'd you? I know it's you, Derek. Don't go out like this, man.
Phil Lamar does a great job bringing him to life, and this was actually his first big role as the main character of a show. And even today, he still has a great fondness for the character.
It was the first time that a teenage African-American superhero was the star of his own cartoon. As a comic book person, growing up, reading mostly stories that didn't reflect my life, it was so amazing to actually be part of something that did.
Virgil is also a gifted student, and while not super popular, he can get along with basically anyone. It's actually that ability to get along with people that gets him caught up in the Big Bang, as he's friends with Wade, one of the local gang leaders at school.
Welcome to our crib, Virgil.
Cozy. This place should be on that show, This Old Warehouse.
I like you, Virgil. You're funny, and you're smart. But keeping Francis off your butt takes too much of my time.
Wade wanted him to man up and take care of his bully problems. Most notably, Francis, another gangbanger at the school. In the show, Wade gives him a gun to take him out, but in the comics, he asks for it himself. Dude was ready to send Francis to white heaven. I think both approaches work. In the comics, the harassment and danger Virgil faces is way harsher. Like, he was fearing for his life, but in the show, it's toned down a bit. Not to mention that while in the comics, he lives with both his mother and father, along with his sister. In the show, his mother, a paramedic, is killed by a stray bullet during a riot, leading to a lifelong hatred of guns. Dwayne was against the change at first because he had wanted to show a strong two-parent household for a black family, to fight against the broken home stereotype, but eventually he came to appreciate the story opportunities it afforded him. In one of my favorite episodes, Flashback, Static manages to travel back in time in an attempt to save his mother's life. She sees the hero her son has become, and we get one of the most touching moments in the entire series.
I don't understand all of it, but if you are my son, I'm so proud of what you're doing. Imagine my boy, a superhero.
He begs her to stay out of danger, but her need to help people is too strong, and she still ends up losing her life. You really get to see where Virgil's sense of justice comes from, and not just his mom, but his father too. My dad wasn't really in my life that much, but I always wanted someone like Robert Hawkins in my corner, a social worker with a tremendous amount of virtue. He kept Virgil on the straight and narrow, all by himself, because you know he didn't play.
Running away from the police? Now I know I've raised you better than that, Virgil. What you did was not only stupid and dangerous, but completely inexcusable.
But Dad...
Get in your room right now!
A big step up from the comics, as he didn't really have much of a defined role there. Virgil is also joined by his best friend and partner in crime fighting, Richie Foley, who is another change from the comic. In the comics, his best friend, and the only other person who knows he's Static, is Frida, his closest friend and childhood crush. She's still in the show, but they're not as close, and by the later seasons, she doesn't really do much. It's a shame because I like her in the comics, but Richie and Virgil work so well together that I'm fine with the change. Not only does Richie provide an emotional support, but he's also responsible for creating a lot of Static's gadgets, like the saucer he flies around on, and the walkie-talkies or shock boxes they talk on.
I call it the Static Saucer. I call it my slick new ride. And just in time for patrol, too. Man, you're the man. Just doing my job.
He's also at the center of some of the best episodes. I really like the episode Power Play, where Richie temporarily gains powers and is finally able to be a hero in his own right, crawling from under Static's shadow. In some ways, Richie is even more nerdy than Virgil, so even though you know he's down to help his boy however he can, you could always tell that he was a little jealous that he never got any powers.
You know, sometimes I think the wrong guy got the powers. Sometimes I think if I... Never mind.
This episode showed him getting meta abilities from the mysterious Ragtag, which, as we all know, accepting something from a weird old man is always the right call. But after being coerced to commit crimes with his new powers, Richie realizes that nothing comes without a price, and if that price is betraying his morals, he can live without the powers. Very good ep. Virgil and Richie actually have a few fights about how much the other is putting in, but they always manage to patch things up. It's a way more realistic depiction of a friendship than if Richie was just blindly following his orders. Richie found himself in another very special episode, this time dealing with gun violence in schools. In the episode Jimmy, a student is bullied mercilessly, to the point where he'll do anything to get revenge. Virgil and Richie tried to befriend him, but it's too late, and finally taking the matters into his own hands, he brings a gun to end his bullying once and for all. The part where he's deciding whether or not to shoot is such a powerful scene. The voice acting and animation really helps sell all the pain and anger that Jimmy is going through.
He's not worth it.
She's right, man. You're all upset about this now, but next week, it won't even matter. Don't mess up your whole life over this.
In all the commotion, Richie ends up getting shot in the leg by accident, and while he ends up being okay, Jimmy ends up going to juvie, while his bullies get off with just some community service and a suspension, which Virgil isn't satisfied with. It's a great nuanced take that shows that this kind of stuff hurts everybody, and no one was in the right. It also shows that people who do wrong things sometimes get off a bit too easy, something that continues to be more and more true every day. Dwayne and Alan ended up winning a Humanitas Award for this episode, and it was one of the many that tackled real problems. Static Shock talked about homeless minors, dyslexia, and you know they had to tackle racism. The episode Sons of the Fathers had Virgil have to confront the fact that his best friend's dad, the father of the person he trusts most in the world, was a bigot.
And now I see why Richie acts like a hood, Maggie. That kid's a bad influence. All his kind are.
Keep your voice down.
And his personal failings drive Richie away and almost get him in a lot of trouble. And as funny as it is to hear Max Goof tell his dad off for being racist.
Well, you got what you wanted, Dad. My best friend's gone because of you and your stupid racism. I hate you! Hey!
You're ignorant.
It doesn't take away from how serious this episode feels. It also has probably the best moment for Virgil's dad in the whole show.
I've seen your kind all my life. A fine, upstanding bigot. His nose so close to the grindstone he can't see anything else. Meanwhile, the world changes and grows, and he's blind to it. Ignorant. And proud of that, too.
This episode shows just how much racism can hurt, and not just the ones you're prejudiced against, but the people around you that you care about. It goes to show that even if they made it more kid-friendly, they didn't want to shy away from the stuff that made Static what it was, and the real issues it addressed. Didn't mean it didn't have fun though. I had a blast just watching this show again. The animation in the first few seasons was really loose and appealing, and even though it looked wonky here and there, it had a real charm to it. A lot of the animation was done by Coco Enterprises, a studio owned by TMS Entertainment. They had previously worked on other WB projects like Freakazoid, Batman, and Superman, and I really liked their stuff. It was really funny how they would just sometimes reuse an explosion from those shows in Static, though like, sir, this is a digital show. I know you didn't bust out sales just for this. In the third and fourth season, the show got a style upgrade that I greatly preferred, streamlining the look and giving Virgil an all-new suit. McDuffie wasn't actually the biggest fan of the first outfit, and wondered why Static had a bra on his head, but over time and with the right changes, he really grew to appreciate it. I still have a soft spot for that looser earlier style though, made watching Static stick it to the baddies really fun. Speaking of, Static had some great villains. Of course you had Francis, who came to be known as Hot Streak after getting caught up in the Big Bang. I love any character voiced by Danny Cooksey. He always gives them a ton of personality. He's probably best known as Jack Spicer from Shaolin Showdown, another Kids WB favorite. He was one of the few recurring villains that Static went up against, with most of them being a monster of the week type deal, never knowing which Bang Baby you were gonna see. But the couple stuck around like Ebon and the Meta Breed.
Call me Ebon, master of shadow and darkness.
Not very modest, are you?
No time for modesty, hero.
Ebon was one of the coolest looking villains of my childhood. That all black silhouette with the purple accents and those awesome shadow powers. Anytime he was on screen, I couldn't look away. I also really liked Shiv, just because I thought his powers were cool, making any kind of energy weapon he wanted. You might ask if he's just Green Lantern with extra steps, but I say shut up. But not every villain had to be faced head on. More often than not, Static would try to reason with them, rather than fight them. It's a real nice aspect of his character, even if at times it got a little ridiculous. For a while, Static would just go to everyone's house to tell their parents. They should have called the show Static Snitch. For a while, most of the baddies tended to be kids Static's age or late teens. But as the show progressed, the villains got a bit older and more menacing. They also started to use more DC villains, as starting with the start of the second season, Static was officially folded into the DCAU, the best thing to ever grace television.
Yeah!
Milestone had never really been part of the main DC universe at that point, minus a one-time crossover event they did, so seeing this was really cool. Static went up against dudes like the Toyman, Sinestro, and even the Joker, which of course led to team-ups with the Justice League. He even got to team up with Batman Beyond in a future version of himself. My favorite was of course the episode where he helps out Green Lantern, which was extra funny since he voiced both characters. He even does Static doing his Green Lantern voice in one episode.
Sometimes I still pretend to be Green Lantern. Hail, Guardians of the Universe!
He didn't just team up with the League though, he had other help, like Rubber Band Man, a former villain that turned over a new leaf and started dating his sister Sharon. He almost became like a big brother to Static, and I always liked seeing them together, even if it took a while for them to put their past behind them. There was also Anansi, an African superhero who held the power of illusions. But the biggest shakeup was when Richie permanently joined Static on crime fighting duty as the hero Gear. After a delayed reaction to the leftover gas on Virgil's clothes from the Big Bang, he developed super intelligence and used it to make a ton of gadgets to help him keep up with Static, including rocket boots and a drone robot called Backpack. The writers were having a hard time keeping Richie in the story, and felt like this was the best compromise, and it was hype when it happened. The ratings also went up too. There were a few unconventional team-ups too with real people like Shaq and Little Romeo, who also ended up doing the final theme song for the show. And while the Romeo cameo was cute, seeing the Shaq attack turn up the volume against some Bang Babies is something I didn't know I needed, but am so glad I got. Not every cameo episode went that smooth though. The episode Hoop Squad was especially bad for Dwayne and the crew, calling it a train wreck of an episode. The only bright spot was the crew getting to meet Karl Malone and him signing autographs for everyone. But all in all, the show was an amazing success. At its peak, the only show it was losing to in ratings was Pokemon, and when reruns hit Cartoon Network, it outperformed everything but Family Guy. Static was rubbing elbows with Peter Griffin. I can't think of a bigger honor. But animation is expensive, and with not much merchandise and low sales of what they did make, after 4 seasons, they pulled the plug on the show. But 52 episodes is nothing to sneeze at, especially nowadays, and McDuffie considered it to be a great success. The number of people that had watched the first episode alone dwarfed the number of sales that the entire run of the comic had made. While McDuffie has said that the 3rd season is by far his favorite, he was a little regretful about the 4th and wished he could have changed things. He was also a little bummed that he couldn't outwardly say that Richie was gay, as the character he was based on from the comics, Rick Stone, has a whole arc about coming out. But as far as Dwayne was concerned, Richie was definitely gay. But like I said, on the whole, Dwayne was satisfied, and so was I. I was afraid that coming back to Static wouldn't be as fun as I'd hoped, but I thoroughly enjoyed myself. The character felt alive, the scenarios were cool, and the writing was both fun and touching. It's not a perfect show, but when I was a kid, it meant the world to me to have a character like this. And honestly, it really helped me come to terms with my identity as a black kid, because Virgil felt just like me, like the kind of hero I would be if I got powers. And the first time that representation aspect really stuck. And I have Dwayne, Dennis, and the rest of the Static Shock team to thank for that. It's a really special show to me, and it deserves to go down in history as a very important show. The show also ended up being very important for Dwayne too, as that's what got him into the world of animation.
Surprised to see me? A little. I'm more surprised that I lived so long.
Batman, Bruce Wayne. Bruce Wayne, Batman. Or have you met?
Not now!
From here, Dwayne went on to work on tons of stuff. He was a big part of Ben 10 Alien Force, which explains why I like the writing so much in those earlier episodes. And he also wrote a few episodes of Teen Titans, like Winner Takes All, which is one of my favorites as a kid. But out of everything he did, his best work of all had to be the episodes of Justice League that he had a hand in. Basically, every single episode that people talk about when they think of the best of the show were written by him. Wildcards, Duffy. Starcross, Duffy. Epilogue, Duffy. Destroyer, with the iciest speech ever given by Superman? That's that I feel like I live in a world made of cardboard. Dude, how do I still have goosebumps? I'm the one reading it. That was McDuffie. This man was one of the coolest people to ever live, and there is nothing you could do to change my mind. And he was 6'7". That isn't important, but I wanted you to know that. He even managed to work in an epilogue for Static, showing him as a member of the Justice League in the future.
Last time I saw you, you were too young to drive. You look good for a man your age.
The miracles of modern medicine. 65 is the new 30.
I don't think any of the commercials spoiled this, so as a kid, when I saw this, I freaked out. You probably could have heard me from 2025. See, there I go right now. I didn't know it at the time, but he was writing moments that I would continue to think about forever. But I didn't know that he wouldn't be here forever. On February 21st, 2011, one day after his birthday, Dwayne Glenn McDuffie would pass away, succumbing to complications from an emergency heart surgery. I still remember reading the news on Facebook, and I couldn't believe it. This was back when I just knew he did Static Shock. I didn't know about all the other shows he worked on and all the ways he helped the black community until later, and I was devastated. I still am. Dwayne McDuffie was a once-in-a-lifetime genius, a man of unshakable morals and limitless creativity, and he was just the right person to tell me that I wasn't being black wrong, that my interests, hobbies, and way I spoke didn't change my heritage and the life I lived, because there is no wrong way to be black. There's no such thing as being black enough. Since Static Shock ended, there have been a few Static sightings since then. He's had some cameos here and there, and he showed up in Young Justice. And even though he wasn't a central character, it was honestly just cool to see him. There's been talk about him getting a live-action movie forever, but there still isn't any major news. Jaden Smith is rumored to play him though if it ever happens, and I kinda hope that stays a rumor. Most importantly, there was a relaunch of a lot of milestone titles, including Static. And while I haven't had the chance to check them out yet, the art alone has me excited to read them. What I really want is a straightforward animated adaptation of the original comics though. It'll never be the same without Dwayne in the pilot seat, but I can think of a few people who could do it justice. Jeff Tramiel comes to mind, as I've been really enjoying his work on that new Spider-Man show. What's really got me excited though, is that a few years back, DC announced that they would be doing an animated milestone movie, showing off a poster featuring Hardware, Icon, Rocket, and Static. And that would be just the right thing to get some love going for these characters. Because Milestone wasn't just their name, it was a fact. These characters are some of the most important things to ever come out of DC. And if it wasn't for the struggles and hard work of the original core founding members, the world of comics would be even harder to break into than it currently is for people like me. Their stories help people from all walks of life to finally see themselves in a medium that could feel like it didn't care about them, to finally see themselves as heroes.
I never knew how important it would be to meet a role model like you.
Role model?
Yeah, a black superhero. I don't know, it validates me somehow.
Heroes come in every color, my friend.
And now they want to make even more stories that people can relate to. So, thank you, Dennis Cowan. Thank you, Michael Davis. Thank you, Derek Dingle. Thank you, Christopher Priest. And thank you, Dwayne McDuffie. And I hope that anyone who's watching this video that has an idea that they need to turn into reality will continue to work on that passion project. Because you never know. It might be you who puts a shock to someone's system.
Shock to your system.